Hello, everyone. The purpose of this mini podcast is to update everyone on mercantilism in the context of Janet Yellen's recent statements about China in April and her follow-up statements in May. Now, as a quick background, we've discussed mercantilism in this space many times, written on it many times. And the reason it's an important or significant driver of governmental as well as market behavior is because it signifies a replacement for globalism. Now, you're not going to hear the word mercantilism used that much, except here and maybe occasionally at Michael Every when he writes. And the reason for that, if you're wondering, is because mercantilism has heavy connotations of bullion, gold, and to a lesser extent, silver. And they don't want that kind of implication circling in the marketplace. So instead, you'll hear words like protectionism, tariffs, trade, protection, all the things that are tools of a mercantilist environment. And those things stand out on their own anyway. But when you factor in all these things are happening at the same time that the world is accumulating gold bullion, then the link to mercantilism is obvious. And we talked about this early on. And while I am proud of that, it's not something that we constantly harp on. But anyway, all the articles are there. Let's get to the update and the context of what Yellen did and why it's relevant. When you have an idea or a concept, it's a big picture concept, you need to check every so often to make sure you're still correct or on the path that you think you're on. And the Yellen statements last month and in April, the April statement was the more important statement, tell us all systems are go on this insane path off of globalization onto mercantilism. Now, I'm not anti-mercantilism. I'm just saying that when you pivot from one economic model, globalism, to another one, you have to. There's a time frame when you contradict yourself openly, and Yellen had been doing it in little ways. Governments have been doing it in little ways all over the world, but Yellen just came out and contradicted herself. Contradicted 40 years, as Luke Groman put it, of economic orthodoxy in the US in one statement. So let's get to that. In April, around April 5th, Janet Yellen came out in her trip to China and, quoting CNN, tackled China over a flood of cheap goods. And during that, here's a quote from a story from CNN. Janet Yellen has kicked off her second visit to China as U.S. Treasury Secretary with a warning of the risk to jobs and businesses posed by overproduction of certain goods in the world's second largest economy. On Friday, her first full day of meetings in the southern megacity of Guangzhou, Yellen said she would address the oversupply of Chinese goods in key industries such as electric vehicles, EVs, and solar panels. And there's a lot more on that. And if I remember, we'll put the link in there for that. What we want to address here is, first of all, what is the substance of what she's saying is China is going to hurt U.S. domestic industries by flooding the market with cheap goods. And that may be true. She's drawing a parallel to Japan in the 80s when they were dumping semiconductors on us and it was hurting our industry. And that was true. And there are other parallels that Western economists want to draw with the China-Japan analogy. That could be true. But staying on what Yellen did and how contradictory it was to 40 years, again, paraphrasing Luke, it's a great phrase, 40 years or more, 50 years probably, of economic orthodoxy. The cheap goods statement, as an American with no economic background, you know that we have benefited from their cheap goods for decades. That has been part of the peace dividend. Globalization, supply chains, price negotiation, because we were the biggest buyer of finished goods, all those things contributed to China selling goods to us cheaply and benefited us greatly. So the first thing you would ask yourself as a non-economist is, since when do we not like Chinese goods that are cheap? And the answer is, since mercantilism stepped in. Now, to tie this to mercantilism and trade protectionism, if you go back a little bit, the United States, and we've gone through this before as well, but just a quick background on it. The United States needs to change its economic engine from service economy, which benefits from globalization, towards a manufacturing economy again. And a manufacturing economy necessitates reshoring and onshoring and friendshoring supply chains. It necessitates self-sufficiency. It necessitates being a low-cost producer of something, and it will eventually necessitate a weaker dollar. Now, the reason that has to happen, which is actually a more normal environment when you think about it, like throughout history, is because over the last 50 years, we have been the consumer of the cheap goods that China has been selling. Now, with the advent's probably the wrong word, with the event of COVID and the fracturing of supply chains and the fragility of international relationships, everyone, not just the United States, realized that the East, or the BRICS, physicality is one of the underpinnings, to paraphrase an Exeter pyramid concept, holding up the West's global finances. And that is most apparent physically when you look at something like, we buy their goods, they buy our bonds. So we carry, and have been carrying, a large current trade deficit with China for years. We buy more from them than they buy from us. And in return, they take their profits and money and they buy our treasuries. So a cynical person would say they lend us money to buy their stuff. And there's truth to that. But the reality of it is this: we buy their stuff because we have a great relationship with them, and they buy our bonds because they have faith in our ability to repay those bonds. And so they'll keep selling to us on credit because we keep proving that we can pay them back, and that we're, hopefully, in the past, reasonable stewards with our monetary policy and fiscal policy, not printing too much. Okay, that's how it was. Now, for Yellen to come out and say, we don't want your cheap goods anymore, and to pivot to a point where she's worried about domestic industry, is consistent with the changes that are undergoing this economic engine change. Think about what Biden has done, successfully or not. Build Back Better was basically a ridiculous label for we're going to return to manufacturing. And there are merits to returning to manufacturing. We have to. And I'll get into why we have to in this conversation as well in a minute. But in order to do that, we need to be the low-cost producer. In order to be the low-cost producer, we need to be able to sell things cheaper than everyone else and still make a profit. And we can't do that if China keeps doing it. And also, we're not buying stuff anymore. You see, collectively as a nation, we're not buying things anymore as a behavioral result of COVID. We're not buying as many. We all loaded up on things, right? Refrigerators, what have you. But we're not buying continuously. So money is getting tight for a large portion of the country. And in getting tight, we're borrowing less. Now, I know individually, some people are borrowing more, some people are borrowing less. But think about the affluent people. They're borrowing less, right? The country's a mess, don't get me wrong. but they're borrowing less. And as a nation, we need China to lend us less because we're buying less. Now, I know the link between public and private isn't obvious, but there is a very strong link. Okay, so simultaneously, China's not willing to lend us anymore. So they don't want to lend us more money. We don't want to buy more stuff. That's the path that we're on. Now, why does this tie in with mercantilism? A lot of people will talk about these concepts, but uh, not understand or not elaborate on what it really means. In a global environment or an environment that where you can do things on credit, you can do it with a parent and a child, for example. Uh, you're allowed to borrow money to buy things on the promise of paying back later. That's pretty obvious. That's debt being used to finance purchases. We all do it from time to time. However, before credit cards, if you're old enough, before credit cards, there were no credit cards. There were, I forget what they actually called them, but they were cash cards. Diners Club was the first. American Express was a version of it. And those cards were what I would call current account cards. So you would buy something with the card, and after 30 days, or if you're old enough, you remember that Diners Club actually had 60 days for years, you would then pay it off in full in 30 days. So you were getting a 30-day no interest loan to buy something. And then you would have to settle up every month. So that wasn't considered credit. It was considered having an account, right? And you had to bring your account current every 30 days. That's current accounting. That's how nations did trade before globalization. Before financialization went international, before the